webinar, We Have an Iran Deal, Now What? Thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. My name is Teresa Schaefer, and I'm the Security Outreach Associate at PSR. I'll be emceeing the webinar tonight. Just some housekeeping before we begin. The webinar will go about an hour, and all attendees will be muted in order to avoid any technical problems. I'm sure a lot of people have questions about the deal, so please send them to us throughout the webinar. Feel free to type them in the question box as we go along, and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A session. Also, if there's some parts of the webinar that you missed, don't worry because everything's being recorded and it'll be available on our YouTube page tomorrow. You'll also receive an email with a link to that along with some additional info tomorrow as well. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Kelsey Davenport. Kelsey is the Director for Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association, where she provides research and analysis on the nuclear and missile programs in Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan, and on nuclear security issues. She holds a master's degree in peace studies from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and as if that weren't qualification enough, she's been on the ground in Vienna following the negotiations and has been on a slew of expert panels talking about the deal, in addition to providing commentary to major media news outlets. A big thanks to Kelsey for being with us here tonight. And Kelsey, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to PSR for hosting this and to all of you who are logging in to listen. From the perspective of the Arms Control Association, the nuclear deal that Iran and 6 world powers, the United States, China, France, Germany, Russia, and the UK reached is really a net plus for nuclear nonproliferation. We view this deal as very strong because it guards against Iran's 2 pathways to nuclear weapons, and it puts in place comprehensive monitoring and verification to ensure that Iran cannot rapidly move to nuclear weapons. I seem to have lost my PowerPoint here. I don't know if people on the call can still see it.
Kelsey, do you have it up on your screen?
No, it just disappeared.
Okay. Can you try and pull up your PowerPoint on your individual screen?
Sure, I can certainly do that. So while this is loading, though, I think it's important to give a little bit of context for the direction of this deal and where Iran's nuclear program was going prior to this historic agreement being reached. Really, the United States has been engaged with its European allies and a number of other key countries in trying to find a resolution to the Iranian nuclear crisis for over a decade. But it wasn't until 2003 that there was a breakthrough in the deal and the negotiations. And that really came in with the election of President Hassan Rouhani in June of 2013. And since then, there's been considerable progress made in terms of the negotiations and restrictions that have already been placed on Iran's nuclear program, including the reaching of an interim deal in November of 2013. And it's important to note that that agreement has been in place for over 18 months and both sides have implemented it faithfully. I think that really speaks towards Iran's intention in terms of actually following through on a comprehensive deal. Hopefully now everybody can see the PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's get started. So as I said, the nuclear deal is a net plus for nonproliferation. It blocks Iran's 2 pathways to nuclear weapons. Iran will not be able to obtain enough highly enriched uranium or plutonium for the core of the nuclear weapon under this deal. And just as important, the deal puts in place stringent monitoring and verification mechanisms. This will not only ensure that Iran is abiding by the strict limitations of the deal, but will also ensure an early alarm if Iran tries to covertly pursue nuclear weapons, which is a legitimate concern given Iran's past. Twice in the past, they've attempted to build illicit uranium enrichment facilities, but both times they have been detected. So first, to dive into the details. One of the most important elements of this deal has to do with the complete package on how the deal blocks Iran's uranium enrichment route. Now, it was very important from the Iranian perspective that it be able to continue to have some uranium enrichment. But the international community, particularly the United States, wanted to ensure that the time it would take for Iran to obtain enough material for a bomb, if it chose to do so, would be dramatically increased, so that the international community would have time to respond. To give you an example, right now, if Iran were to use its existing infrastructure of about 19,000 centrifuges and its stockpiles of enriched uranium, it would have enough material for a nuclear weapon in 2 to 3 months. Under the restrictions in the deal, that timeline will be over 12 months. And that increase in time is obtained through a variety of measures. First of all, Iran's centrifuges will be dramatically reduced. The number of total centrifuges will drop from 19,000 to only 6,104 centrifuges, of which 5,060 machines will be operating. The operating machines is less than half of the capacity that Iran currently has. It currently operates about 10,200 centrifuges. So that's a reduction in half of the capacity. And all of the uranium enrichment activities will take place at Iran's Natanz facility. So the other facility, Fordow, will not have uranium enrichment for at least 15 years. And that's important because the Fordow facility is located deep within the Granite Mountain near the city of Qom, and it's very difficult to access. So if Iran did decide to pursue nuclear weapons and it wanted to enrich at Fordow, it would be a difficult area to target in terms of a military strike. Now, Iran will have about 1,000 centrifuges at Fordow, but many of these centrifuges will be repurposed to produce stable isotopes, and the rest will not be operating at all. Now, all of the excess centrifuges will not only be removed from the facilities at Natanz and Fordow, but they'll also be stored under seal. And it's important to really get an idea of what that means when a centrifuge is stored under IAEA seal. The IAEA uses very sophisticated monitoring and verification techniques to ensure that these seals are not broken. The seals operate sort of via radio, so if there is an attempt to access these additional centrifuges, it will immediately alert the International Atomic Energy Agency. And any changes in the centrifuges, any reinstallation of new machines to replace broken machines will also be monitored by the agency. And this is very important because it means that Iran will not be able to siphon off machines that it already has constructed and try and use those to build a covert facility. Now, there'll also be limits in the deal on Iran's research and development of advanced centrifuges. And the limits throughout the duration of the agreement are very important. For the first 10 years, Iran will be conducting very strict research and development on single machines in terms of its advanced program. These machines are much more efficient than Iran's current machines, which is known as the IR-1 centrifuge. And limiting these machines is important because if Iran were to be able to conduct sophisticated research and development on advanced centrifuge machines, including in cascade configurations, it would be much easier for Iran to move quickly towards nuclear weapons at the end of the deal because they would be able to deploy a number of these advanced centrifuge machines. But under the deal, as I said, research and development on advanced centrifuges is limited, and it's really only until years 9 and 10 of the agreement that Iran can even begin to produce advanced centrifuge machines. And then it's limited to 200 of 2 different types of machines, and it cannot produce the rotors. So this means that after 10 years, when Iran can move away from the IR-1 centrifuge machines, it won't be able to install a large number of advanced machines. And as an additional layer of precaution, any advanced machines that Iran installs, it'll have to remove the equivalent capacity in IR-1 machines. Essentially what that means is that the 12-month breakout time, so the 12 months that it would take Iran to obtain enough uranium for a bomb, will continue after 10 years and really through 13 years. And then in years 14 and 15, that'll start to drop a little. But essentially, it ensures that Iran is not going to sort of go over the cliff and after year 10 have a breakout time of near zero. There is a lot of criticism in the deal sort of about that the limits expire after 10 years, and that really is not true. There are layers of limitations. One of the layers of limitations also has to do with Iran's stockpile of enriched material. Now, the breakout time is not only a function of how many centrifuges Iran is operating, but also how much enriched uranium it has on hand. Now, uranium enriched to less than 5% is what's typically used for nuclear power reactors. Uranium enriched to greater than 90% is what is used in nuclear weapons. So for 15 years, Iran will only be able to enrich to 3.67%. And it will only be able to keep 300 kilograms of enriched uranium in its stockpile. So anything that Iran produces above that level will need to be shipped out of the country or diluted back down to natural uranium. And before Iran receives any sanctions relief, it will need to reduce the number, the size of that stockpile down to 300 kilograms. It's also important to realize that within every element of this deal, there's going to be very strict accountancy. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which will be charged with monitoring the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program, will be able to monitor every element of Iran's fuel cycle. So from the mining of uranium ore to its conversion to gas to the enrichment levels, the IAEA will have a very clear picture of how much uranium is in Iran and in what form. This helps ensure that no material is being siphoned off for a covert program. And the same is true with the centrifuge components. The International Atomic Energy Agency will conduct a thorough inventory at the onset of the deal of how many parts Iran has, how many different types of machines, and monitor that throughout, again, providing more assurance that Iran is not covertly pursuing a nuclear weapons program. Now on to the plutonium pathway. And the plutonium pathway restrictions are even stronger than those on the uranium route. And really, the plutonium pathway is effectively blocked for the duration of Iran's nuclear program. Now, Iran currently has one reactor that is not yet completed at the Iraq site. If this reactor were completed as designed, it would produce enough weapons-usable plutonium every year for about 2 nuclear weapons. Under the deal, Iran has to remove the core of that reactor and refit it with a modified core that will essentially ensure that Iran produces really no weapons-usable plutonium on a yearly basis. And as an extra assurance, that spent fuel will be shipped out of the country. Now, weapons-usable plutonium is extracted from spent fuel through a mechanism called reprocessing. And Iran has also committed not to reprocess for 15 years. And that's a strict prohibition. But within the text, they've also added another commitment that they intend to never reprocess their spent fuel. That means that spent fuel from nuclear power reactors that have yet to be built and from Iran's current power reactor that's fueled by the Russians, all of that spent fuel will be shipped out. That is how Iran is currently dealing with the spent fuel from the Bushehr reactor, which is the Russian-operated power reactor that it currently has. So again, an extra layer of precaution that Iran will not be able to reprocess spent fuel. It's also important to note that Iran does not even currently have a facility where it could reprocess fuel. And if it wanted to build one, it would need to ship in some very specific components to build the proper facility to actually allow it to do that type of reprocessing. And all of those items are on a list of materials that can be used for nuclear programs that will be monitored. So again, if Iran tried to take steps towards this, it would likely be detected. And that really brings me into sort of the monitoring and verification of the deal. Now, the monitoring of Iran's known facilities is extremely strong. The deal puts together a multi-layered approach that puts continuous monitoring on every element of Iran's fuel cycle. This essentially ensures that if Iran wanted to pursue nuclear weapons covertly, it would need to reconstruct its entire supply chain. And there are enough layers of redundancy within that Iran would very likely be detected if it tried to covertly pursue pursue nuclear weapons. So the first set of limits really lasts for about 10 years, and that's what I mentioned earlier about the restriction to 5,060 IR-1 operating centrifuges. And after that, Iran will be able to phase in some of its advanced machines, but there will still be restrictions on its capacity for about 15 years. Also for 15 years, as I mentioned, the stockpile will be capped at 300 kilograms. There will be no enrichment at Fordo and no new heavy water reactors. And heavy water reactors are the type of reactors that are best suited to weapons-grade plutonium production. But looking down the road then, for 20 years, there will be continuous surveillance of Iran's centrifuge production areas. That essentially ensures that the international community will have a clear picture of how many machines Iran is producing. So if it looks like Iran intends to ramp up its uranium enrichment capacity, the international community will have early warning by its monitoring of Iran's centrifuge production areas. And again, that also includes a strict accountancy throughout to ensure that Iran isn't siphoning off centrifuges for a covert program. There will also be continuous surveillance of uranium mines and mills. And this means that all of Iran's uranium ore will be accounted for as soon as it's taken out of the ground. Iran currently operates 2 uranium mines at Sarhan and Nichi, and these will be, and all of the output from these mines and mills will be strictly accounted for, again, to ensure that there's no diversion. Now, that restriction will last for 25 years, but more permanently will be Iran's implementation of the additional protocol. Now, the additional protocol is an agreement between Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency that strengthens the Standard Safeguards Agreement. As a member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Iran has to have a safeguards agreement in place with the IAEA. And that essentially allows the agency to come in and inspect Iran's nuclear facilities and ensure that its nuclear activities are exclusively peaceful. Now, the addition of the international protocol really expands the IAEA's access. It became apparent in the 90s with the cases of Iraq and North Korea that the traditional safeguards models were not sufficient. And that's when the additional protocol was devised. And essentially, it allows the International Atomic Energy Agency to visit a broader range of Iran's nuclear facilities. Essentially, everything involved with Iran's nuclear supply chain is subject to regular inspection. And it allows the IAEA to conduct these inspections on much shorter notice, sometimes as little as 2 hours. Then it also gives provisions for the International Atomic Energy Agency to verify that Iran is not conducting illicit nuclear activities outside of its declared nuclear work. What that essentially means is if the International Atomic Energy Agency has concerns that Iran is conducting illicit weaponization activities and has evidence to that effect, they can present that evidence to Iran and ask for access to a site, even if it's a military site. Iran then can put down some conditions if it feels like it needs to protect sensitive information, but ultimately it's up to the IAEA to determine if the access Iran granted is sufficient. Now, under a typical additional protocol, this is not a time-bound process, but the drafters of the agreement wanted to ensure that Iran could not stonewall on international inspector access for a long time, and thus giving Iran time to clean up any illicit activities. So under the deal, if Iran and the IAEA cannot come to an agreement on access in 14 days, then a joint commission will review the IAEA's request. And the joint commission is made up of the P5+1 members. So again, that's China, France, Germany, Russia, the UK, and the United States, as well as representatives from Iran and the European Union, so 8 total members. And the Joint Commission will have 7 days to rule on the IAEA's request, and that will require a consensus vote. So 5 of the 8 members need to agree that the IAEA should have a certain level of access, and then Iran has 3 days to implement that access. So again, this is just an extra layer by making this a time-bound process to ensure that Iran cannot stonewall IAEA access if there are concerns about illicit nuclear activity. Again, then another permanent commitment, the commitment not to reprocess plutonium. And also it's important to keep in mind Iran's NPT obligations, which also are permanent. And that, of course, includes the commitment not to pursue nuclear weapons. And then on top of that commitment, in the deal, Iran even undertook further commitments not to engage in certain types of research and explosive testing and nuclear and design work that would be relevant to a nuclear weapon. And again, that also is permanent. So an extra layer of restrictions there that Iran agreed to that continues to provide assurance that Iran cannot covertly pursue nuclear weapons. Now, as I said, detecting covert facilities is going to be one of the main challenges of the agreement going forward. Again, this is in part because of Iran's past activities. It tried to build the Natanz and Fordow facilities in secret. Both times that those activities were uncovered. And really these negotiations came about because the IAEA had concerns that Iran was undertaking weaponization activities. This is what's now known as the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. And when Iran did not cooperate with the IAEA regarding these past activities, that is when the IAEA first went to the Security Council in 2006 and requested Security Council action. So again, the idea that Iran, may consider cheating on this deal is not outside of the realm of possibility. But in addition to the additional protocol, in which I just laid out how inspectors will be able to access non-declared facilities in a time-bound process, there are also a number of other measures that help guard against covert facilities. Another implementation mechanism that Iran will put in place under the deal is what's referred to as Code 3.1. And that's another element of Iran's agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. And essentially, it will ensure that the agency will have early notification of any new nuclear facilities, meaning that when Iran decides to build a new nuclear power plant, or when it makes any design changes to its existing facilities, it will have to let the IAEA know as soon as the decision is made. Right now, it only needs to give the IAEA 6 months. So that could provide a warning if Iran is deciding to make any changes to its nuclear program. Also, an additional measure under the deal that's very strong that will help guard against illicit activity is the restrictions on Iran's procurement of goods and materials and technologies that could be used to advance the nuclear program. These are often referred to as dual-use technologies because they have applicability to a nuclear program, but they also sometimes are used for non-nuclear purposes. And all of Iran's procurement of these materials will be subject to monitoring and approval. The Joint Commission that's set up by the deal will have a procurement working group. And that procurement working group is made up of the same members, Iran, the P5+1, and the European Union. And any attempt by an Iranian entity to purchase these dual-use technologies or materials will be subject to approval. The procurement working group can also conduct what's called end-use monitoring checks. Essentially what that means is, end-use certificates checks. Essentially what that means is that members of the working group can actually go to the entities that purchase these materials and ensure that all of the material or technology ended up for the stated purpose. That again provides extra assurance that Iran is not siphoning off material for a covert program. Now, Iran's exports of materials that can be used for a nuclear purpose will also be subject to monitoring and approval by the Joint Commission. And that's a good check against any sort of spread of proliferation or nuclear technology. So it was good to see that also reflected in the deal. Now, when thinking about the implementation, it's also important to know sort of the time frame, and that Iran will not receive sanctions relief until it has taken these key steps to restrict its nuclear program. So the phase we are in now is leading up to the actual adoption of the deal. And essentially what this phase allows is for each side to work through their own domestic processes. So in the United States, that includes the 60-day congressional review process, the 10 days for the president to veto any vote, any resolution of disapproval on the deal, because a resolution of disapproval would essentially block the president from waiving certain sanctions. And then another 10-day period for Congress to decide if it wants to try and override that veto. So a total of 82 days. And that 82-day clock started on Sunday when the Obama administration officially submitted the deal and the paperwork to Congress. Iran also has a domestic process of its own. When Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif introduced the deal to the Iranian parliament today, it was decided that a committee would review the deal, and then the Iranian parliament would actually vote itself within 80 days. So after these steps occur, then there will be sort of the official adoption of the deal. And at that point, each side will begin to take action to pave the way towards implementation. And on the Iranian side, that includes key nuclear restrictions, including the removal of excess centrifuges, the reduction of its stockpile of enriched uranium. It will need to remove the core of the Iraq reactor. It will put in place monitoring and verification mechanisms. And it will also have to provide the IAEA with information about the possible military dimensions of Iran's nuclear program. Now, the IAEA's PMD investigation is both tied to this deal and also separate. And there's been a lot of misconceptions about how these processes are related. Now, under the text of the deal, Iran needs to provide the agency with information and explanations about the IAEA's concerns regarding these past military dimensions. It will initially provide the IAEA with that information by August 15th, and then there'll be a 2-month period in which the IAEA can ask follow-up questions and Iran can clarify those questions. And that really is what is required on the Iranian side before implementation of the deal. The IAEA will then issue a final assessment which will look at Iran's possible military dimensions in their relation to a nuclear weapons program. But the issuing of that assessment does not affect the sanctions relief at all. All Iran has to do is provide the IAEA with the information to fulfill its commitments under the deal. Now, there are also actions on the P5+1 side before the deal can we reach sort of the implementation day. The first of those actions had to do with the UN Security Council endorsing the deal, and that actually took place on Monday. There was a unanimous vote in the UN Security Council, and not only does this endorse the deal, but it lays the groundwork for lifting UN Security Council sanctions. There have been a number of UN Security Council resolutions, 6 in total, on Iran's nuclear program since 2006, many of which have put in place sanctions. This will help lift those sanctions when implementation of the deal begins, and also provide a mechanism for putting the sanctions back in place. And essentially how that works is that any member of the P5+1 can go to the Security Council if they feel like Iran is not complying with the deal and introduce a resolution. And vetoing that resolution is what will put the sanctions back in place. This ensures that no member country can block the reimposition of sanctions throughout the deal. Now, in terms of other steps, there will need to be preparation for sanctions lifting on both the US and the EU side, and then also, and that includes getting the legal authorities ready. Now, before I end, there are a few criticisms that I want to address. We've seen a lot coming from particularly members of the U.S. Congress attacking the nuclear deal. One of the most prevalent is this idea that there is a better deal out there. There is no better agreement, and trying to get one would risk losing a very good deal at hand. What's important about this deal is that it meets the core concerns of both sides. And because this deal also gives Iran what it needs, sanctions relief and continuing a small nuclear program, that essentially means that Iran has a lot of buy-in to actually continue implementing the deal, and that's very important. You know, what's more, if the United States had tried to turn the screws a little tighter on sanctions in turn for greater Iranian concessions, the United States would have lost a great deal of international support. And international support is really what has kept the sanctions regime together. So this idea that there's a better deal, you know, I don't think is based in a realistic assessment of what was attainable within the nuclear deal. You know, there also is an idea that there needs to be anytime, anywhere inspection. That is a very unrealistic expectation. No country is going to allow carte blanche access to international inspectors of its nuclear sites. It's also completely unnecessary. The international community can be assured that the International Atomic Energy Agency will have the access when it needs it and where it needs it under this deal to ensure that there's no covert activity. Also, as I pointed out, you know, this deal does not end in 10 years. Despite some critics saying that these limitations expire in 10 years. Many restrictions last well beyond 10 years, 10, 15, 25 years, and others are permanent. Also, there's this emerging critique that the Iran deal will lead to an arms race in the Middle East. But really, under this deal, because Iran's nuclear program is limited and highly monitored, regional countries have a little incentive to pursue nuclear weapons programs. And I think it is very clear that should countries like Saudi Arabia choose to pursue enrichment, they would be subject to intense scrutiny. This would be a very costly process and perhaps not something that the Saudis really want to enter into, particularly given that Iran's pathways to nuclear weapons will be blocked under this deal. Also, you know, for the past decade, Iran's nuclear program has really been unrestricted, and countries in the region have still chosen not to pursue nuclear programs. So there are a number of other steps too that the United States and its allies can take to head off any sort of enrichment cascade in the region. So I don't put a lot of credence in this idea that the Iran deal will lead to a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. So really the bottom line of this deal is that it blocks Iran's pathways to nuclear weapons, it guards against covert nuclear activities, and it really is a benefit to U.S. national security and regional security. And I'm happy to end there and take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, for that excellent summary of the deal. So at this point, now that you have the details of the agreement, here's what you can do to protect it from Congress. The most important thing you can do right now is to get in touch with your senators and representatives. You can do this by calling their offices, or you can also send them an email. PSR currently has an action alert to email your representative that includes a sample message which you can personalize. That'll make it easier for you to email your congressperson. Details about this will be sent to you in a follow-up email tomorrow. But even better would be to meet with your senators and representatives while Congress is in recess. Congress members will be back in their home states from August 10th to September 8th. So we really encourage people to call their local offices now and set up a meeting to meet with their Congress members in person. This will have a much bigger impact if you have an in-person meeting. Another option is to write a letter to the editor. I'm sure you've seen Iran deal news all over the media. The media is heavily covering it right now. So it'd be the perfect time to voice your support through a letter to the editor. We'll also include guidelines on how to submit those to the email we send you tomorrow. Social media is another effective means to voice your opinion. You can post to Facebook in support of the deal, or you can tweet your support using #IranDeal. And then if you link your post or your tweet to our action alert to email your representative, that could be even more effective. Tweeting at members of Congress is also a great way to lobby them. You can look up their Twitter handle and just write a tweet asking them to support the deal. Okay, so this concludes the content part of the webinar. My information as well as Kelsey's is listed if you have any further questions about anything. And at this point, we'll move into the Q&A session. So I've received received a couple of questions so far. If you haven't had a chance to submit them yet, please type them into the question box. And our first question is from Mike, and he asks, why weren't all the monitoring provisions made permanent? Is 24 days too long of a time to resolve disputes between the IAEA and Iran over suspicious military sites?
Those are great questions, Mike. First, regarding the question about the time frame for the 24 days. Essentially, what the IAEA will be looking for is it looks for covert nuclear activities, particularly any type of facility that's being built that will allow Iran to begin to amass fissile material for a bomb. And that would be very likely to be related to the uranium enrichment route, because it's very easy to detect this type of reactors that produce plutonium, particularly using sort of geothermal signatures and satellites. So with the introduction of uranium, though, to any of these facilities, that leaves a trace on the environment. So during the 24-day period, Iran may be able to remove any of the infrastructure that it was using, but it won't be able to eliminate those traces of uranium. The IAEA has very sophisticated environmental sampling techniques that it uses to analyze soil samples from walls inside of facilities, runoff samples, to see if there is uranium present. And that gives a much clearer picture about what Iran was doing in terms of sort of the introduction of nuclear elements. I think it's also important to see the sort of the concerns about illicit activities and the access sort of within 24 days within the larger picture of the monitoring and verification, including this procurement channel. Many of the materials that Iran would need to set up some of these duplicate sort of covert sites to enrich uranium, to turn uranium into gas, those are all monitored materials. And based on Iran's procurement in the past, Iran really does not have the domestic capabilities to produce some of these materials to the grade necessary for nuclear work. That includes certain types of ring magnets, certain types of steel and carbon fiber. So watching the procurement there will also ensure that Iran can't begin to build these facilities in the first place. So hopefully that kind of answers the question about 24-day access. Regarding whether or not all of the restrictions were made permanent, it was very important to Iran that at the end of this process, after it answered questions about its past work, after it gave more in terms of transparency in the onset, that it returned to being sort of a normal status within sort of the IAEA and NPT member states. And essentially what that means is it didn't want to accept restrictions beyond what other countries are required to accept. So the additional protocol, which is a standard mechanism in place in over 120 countries, that will remain in place and be permanent. And that really is what's the most important, because that will allow the IAEA to conduct these very short notice inspections, to continue to access suspect sites for as long as Iran is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So it can continue to follow up after the continuous monitoring mechanisms have been phased out over time. I mean, in short, I don't think that Iran ever would have agreed to keeping these restrictions in permanently. What Iran has said, though, that I think is worth exploring from the international community should consider exploring, as well as countries in the region, is Iran has said it would be willing to take on some of these extra measures permanently if other countries in the region were bound to the same restrictions. So, for instance, Iranian diplomats have said they'd be willing to limit themselves to enrich uranium to power grade levels, so that 3.6% level, for the duration of their nuclear program, if there was a region-wide agreement to also only enrich to those levels. So during these time periods of the restrictions, I think it is worth exploring whether or not the region as a whole would be willing to make some of these to take some of these steps and to see what the United States may be able to do to facilitate some of that.
Great, thanks, Kelsey. So we have another question from Art Milholland, and he's questioning the monitoring of the Iran deal, and he's wondering about the manpower and the expertise to fulfill all the monitoring requirements. So perhaps you can describe a little bit about the IAEA and how they will manage monitoring of the agreement.
Sure, I can definitely do that. So right now, the Iran team that monitors Iran's nuclear program for the IAEA that really looks at implementation of the interim deal is about 50 people. That includes inspectors and people on the ground at the IAEA headquarters in Vienna to analyze the data. Under the deal, that number, the number of inspectors, will be increased to between 130 and 150 people. So that's a significant personnel increase that I think will be important to ensure that there are enough inspectors on the ground to access these facilities and ensure sort of high quality reporting. The IAEA also has a number of sophisticated technologies at its disposal that it can employ to help with this. You know, I mentioned particular sort of radio seals that alert the IAEA directly if there's any attempts to tamper. There are also monitors that can continuously check Iran's uranium enrichment levels. These are sort of flow machines that can be introduced, into Iran's sort of centrifuge infrastructure to ensure that enrichment is not above 3.67%. So technologies like these that feed directly back to the IAEA and can be tampered with also cut down in terms of, the number of people and the manpower that is required to actually implement the deal. One of the areas, though, where I think the IAEA will need assistance is ensuring that it actually has the financial resources to carry out this agreement. In 2014, it cost about 12.5 million euros to implement the Iran safeguards, and that number is only going to increase with this enhanced monitoring and verification under the comprehensive deal. So it will be important to ensure that Iran has the money required, that the IAEA has the money required to actually implement the deal.
Great, thanks. So we have another question here. What does Iran say they plan to do with the allowed 5,060 IR-1 centrifuges?
Well, under the deal, Iran will eventually be able to produce nuclear fuel for the Iraq reactor. That reactor, as I said, is going to be redesigned in a way that will allow the reactor to produce medical isotopes that Iran can use for various sort of cancer and radiation therapies and minimize the production of weapons-grade plutonium. So that reactor will run on uranium enriched to 3.67%. And it looks like the initial fuel load for that reactor will be about 350 kilograms. So as Iran works with the international community to learn how to fabricate fuel properly for that reactor, its centrifuges will be producing uranium that Iran will sell, ship out, or dilute to ensure that it stays below that 300 level. And then after it's able to actually produce fuel, some of the enriched material will go into fueling the Iraq reactor. Eventually Iran has said that it wants to build up its uranium enrichment capacity to actually fuel the Bushehr reactor, which is currently fueled by the Russians. But under the deal, Iran is nowhere near the capacity to actually provide fuel for that reactor, so Russia will continue to do so. In part, Iran is keeping the 5,060 operating centrifuges because it was important to the Iranian narrative to say that it's continued its nuclear program. Yes, the number right now is in excess of what Iran needs, but as I said earlier, ensuring that Iran can say to its domestic audience that it's met its core goals is important to the deal because that will ensure greater buy-in from Iran and a greater commitment to actually implement the deal.
Perfect. And we have a follow-up question to the IAE question, and that question is, where will the significantly increased numbers of IAEA experts come from?
Well, under the terms of the agreement, Iran can still request that inspectors from certain countries not be allowed on the team, particularly countries that it does not have diplomatic relations with. So countries like the United States, initially it will likely, individuals from these countries likely will not be on the inspections team. In terms of the other nationalities, there's a wide variety of nationalities that work for the IAEA, that work on these inspections teams. The process for becoming sort of certified to work as an inspector is very rigorous. I think that it takes up to 2 years of training at the agency to get to that level. So it's a wide variety of people who are very thoroughly trained to carry out these missions. It's important to know that the IAEA's member states comprise of over 150 countries. And it works hard to recruit staff members from a diversity of backgrounds.
Great. So our next question comes from Bruce Rosen, and he's wondering about the demand for business that will happen with Iran as a result of this agreement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that in terms of countries going back into Iran, particularly from the United States side, it is going to remain very slow at first. That's because the United States has a variety of sanctions in place on Iran, not only related to its nuclear program, but there are a number of restrictions related to human rights and terrorism, and those will all still remain in place. Also, because under the deal, sanctions can be reversed or snapped back if there's a violation, some countries may be hesitant at first in terms of wanting to see if Iran is actually going to abide by its commitments under the deal. That being said, I think that there are a number of European countries and, of course, Russia and China, all of whom have done business with Iran more recently and have been involved in the Iranian economy more recently, that are likely to begin to go back into that country. Iran will also receive about $120 billion of its own money back under the deal. And that's revenue from oil sales that essentially is Iran's money that's been trapped in foreign banks. Now, Iran is very likely to use the majority of that money for domestic infrastructure projects. And President Rouhani ran on a platform where he promised an improvement in the Iranian economy, and he'll really need that money to jumpstart some of those improvements. So I think that there will be sanctions, that the sanctions relief will yield real economic gains for Iran, but it will be slow, and it isn't likely to come from the U.S. sector, at least initially.
Okay, and we have one more question. Saudi Arabia has been making a lot of comments about the Iran deal. Can you give us an idea of how Saudi Arabia has responded to the announcement of the deal?
Well, Saudi Arabia has opposed the Iran deal because it did not call for the complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Now, it's a very similar call to what we've heard from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, that the only metric by which to measure a good deal is if it completely eliminates Iran's nuclear program. That's a very unrealistic expectation. Iran was never going to enter into negotiations with the idea of completely giving up its nuclear program. Now, Saudi Arabia does have concerns about sort of the larger security of the Gulf, and I think is concerned that this deal could pave the way to an increased U.S.-Iranian cooperation in the region and on other issues. But the Iranian-U.S. relationship is marked by decades of mistrust. while this deal is an important step in the right direction and hopefully will open up other doors for cooperation, I think that it is extremely unlikely that Iran and the United States are going to mend fences overnight. The United States will remain committed to its other allies in the region. Now, there have been some reports that Saudi Arabia will just buy a nuclear weapon from Pakistan. I do not put any credit by that assertion, whatsoever. I don't think Pakistan would be so foolhardy as to openly sell Saudi Arabia or try and covertly sell Saudi Arabia a nuclear weapon. There would certainly be dire international consequences for that. And Saudi Arabia has said in the past that if Iran was allowed to keep its nuclear infrastructure and enrich uranium, that it would pursue a similar capacity to enrich uranium. I don't take the Saudi claim that they intend to do this particularly seriously at this point. If Saudi Arabia begins to take steps towards uranium enrichment capacity, there's going to be a great deal of international suspicion. And I think Saudi Arabia will be pressured to open up its nuclear program to the type of intrusive inspections and monitoring that Iran is going to have on its programs to provide assurance that Saudi Arabia is not building this capacity to leverage it toward a nuclear weapon in the future. Some people say that Iran has come out of this deal with its nuclear program intact, but it's important to remember that Iran has endured devastating economic sanctions that have had a catastrophic effect on its economy over the past decade, and now is going to be subject to more strict limitations and monitoring and verification than any other nuclear country in the world. I don't think Saudi Arabia wants to go down that path. And if it began to take steps towards a nuclear weapons capability, I think there would be a great push to put it on that path to limitations and greater restrictions.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering those questions for us, Kelsey. And at this point, I'll go ahead and wrap up the Q&A. I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us tonight and for all of your excellent questions. If for some reason we weren't able to answer your question, please feel free to email either myself or Kelsey, and we're more than happy to respond. We hope that this webinar has provided some insight into the Iran deal, and we hope it's given you enough information you need in order to lobby Congress and get them to support the deal as well. I want to let you know that as soon as you close out of the webinar, there will be a quick poll. If you could answer that poll for us, we'd greatly appreciate it to kind of gauge our audience's opinion after the webinar. So with that, I'd like to thank Kelsey once again, and have a great rest of your night, everyone.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Great job. You really know this stuff